Mr. Chairman, the subtitle we're considering right now is just one part of a massive spending program that the Democrats plan to introduce over the next 2 weeks, much of which has not yet been written. We only received the text for this in the last 48 hours. Probably nobody in this room has read the entire thing. One of the things that people don't like about Congress, our approval rating about 25%, is that it's broken and it's too partisan and that there's no debate. And there's been no debate on this particular provision, this particular subtitle. There was a bipartisan subtitle in the works from the Workers and Family Support Subcommittee, which has been jettisoned by the Democrats in favor of this much more socialist approach. A socialist, this massive $3.5 trillion program that the Democrats are proposing over the next 2 weeks will radically shift the United States government to a much larger footprint with more regulation and more taxes, bigger government, and a radical shift towards socialism that the American people do not need and do not want. The Democrats, and even worse, because it hadn't even been written yet, there have been no hearings on any of this. There's been no debate on these specific provisions. We're flying blind. And because it's been written in such haste, there are many, many errors that surely are included in these bills that no one is even aware of because they haven't read the bill. The Democrats call this a paid leave program, but in reality, the bill we're considering is a reckless tax and spending program that is completely disconnected from employers and work. It's a new cash benefits program and lacks adequate safeguards to prevent abuse. It raises significant concerns about fraud and individuals taking advantage of the program. As we have heard today, the Department of Treasury neither has the expertise nor the desire to administer this program. Democrats should have coordinated with the Treasury instead of rushing through this flawed program. This proposal was released 48 hours before we are considering it today. The lack of time and effort in drafting is demonstrated by its many, many flaws. One issue we've not covered yet is the fact that there is nothing in this proposal that would prevent multiple caregivers from taking leave for the same paid leave time. In other words, if there are several people working in the same household, they can all take leave and take the credit for the same issue. Under this bill as written, there was nothing to prevent two parents from taking the same paid leave time to care for their child or grandparent. Duplicate receipt of benefits is bad policy. It shows how poorly thought out this program is and just how unready for prime time the underlying bill is. My amendment would simply prohibit individuals in the same household from being treated as engaging in qualified caregiving for the same caregiving reason for the same caregiving hour. Unless Democrats intentionally design the program to allow for duplicated benefits to be received at the same time, they should adopt my amendment and make a small improvement to their otherwise flawed bill. Mr. Chairman, I urge passage of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does the gentleman from California continue to insist on his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized to speak on the amendment. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate my friend from South Carolina's attention to this matter. But I'm going to label this an anti-father amendment. And I do so because child rearing practices are changing and changing for the better. There are many fathers who wish to bond with their children. there are many fathers who recognize that family unification is an important aspect of American culture and American life. And so to deny in some instances a father the same rights as a mother or the same privileges as a mother, I think defeats our purpose. Fathers also care for members of the family. There are more and more fathers who recognize that role differentiation does not have to exist in the same way that some have viewed it and some have seen it. And so while I understand my friend's amendment, I have to oppose it on those bases and urge a no vote.
Thank the gentleman. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this amendment? The gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I want to associate myself with the comments of Chairman Davis and just say that I'm a little bit disappointed by this amendment for reasons that Mr. Davis has stipulated. You know, family leave, it's a family leave situation. Wife is just had the baby. Of course, the husband wants and needs to be there. Both of them would be eligible for family leave at the same time. If mama dies, does the son-in-law not to get to go to the funeral because the daughter is going? It is a really lack of insight into human suffering and human needs, and this amendment should be squarely rejected, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I've yielded back.
The gentlelady from Alabama is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the comments of both the gentlelady from Wisconsin, as well as the chairman. You know, I think about the fact that I recently lost my mom, and I was very grateful that it wasn't just me by myself offering her care, but rather that it was a family unit that helped to take care of her. And so I think that the substance of this particular amendment really goes against the heart of what caregiving is all about. It shouldn't necessarily be one person's burden, and rather it is a collective caring of that individual by the whole entire family. And so I think that by the very nature of this amendment and the culture of caring given family units, that we should oppose this amendment.
Terry?
And I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Terry Sewell. I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues who preceded me. And I also want to add that as somebody who has cared for two parents with Alzheimer's, sometimes it's necessary to have two members of the family in the household in order to help lift somebody, to get them to the shower, in order to bathe them, or to help them dress. And so this amendment really just completely undermines the whole point of the Leave Act, which is to allow family members to provide the care that is needed and that is deserved by their family members. And with that, I will yield back.
Gentlelady, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield to the author of the amendment, Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. So without limitation, then, if we have a family, say, with 5 siblings and one of them gets sick, then everybody takes off under the guise of taking care of that sibling. If a family member with 4 children, one of the parents gets sick, has the flu, then everybody gets off under the terms of this law. It has to be paid in accordance with this law. This is a perfect example of ill thought out legislation and an example of how some folks in this room think they know better than the American people of how to take care of the American. They don't think the American people or the employers are smart enough or reliable enough or ethical enough to allow for these situations. They feel like they have to have these one size fits all mandates that as a part of a much broader bill that will radically raise taxes, that will make our country less competitive in the world, that will radically increase regulation, that will stifle small business, that will make people more reliant on the government, that will make people less apt to work, that will punish producers. They feel like that in spite of all that, they should make these mandates because they know best and the American people can't take care of themselves. And the result of all this will be, just like it was with the massive government programs under Obamacare and others that came out of the 2009 Obama-Biden administration, and the massive taxes increases and the massive regulation will be, this predictable, it's going to happen. If this became law, and it's not going to become law, thank God. But if this did happen, what we will see is, again, stagnation of the economy. We'll see wages stagnate. We've already seen inflation kick up, which is another disguised tax on people of every income strata from the bottom to the highest. We will see poverty increase. It's predictable. It happened last time. It'll happen again. And why will it happen? Because my friends on the other side of the aisle feel like big government is the answer, feel like they know better than the American people, know better than small business owners, know better than employers. They feel like these one-size mandates, that they have to do it to make sure that everybody's taken care of, when in fact, as my colleagues noted earlier, people still risk their lives every single day to come to this country. They're beating down their doors to come to this country without this massive move towards socialism, which will in fact stifle our economy and make American workers and American citizens worse off instead of better off. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair is prepared to call the vote on this. All those in favor of the gentleman from South Carolina's amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Are there any?
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman from South Carolina has requested a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind votes no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascrell?
Pascrell votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins? Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene?
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi?
No.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta?
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford?
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett?
Plaskett votes nay.
Ms. Plaskett votes nay. Mr. Brady?
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunes?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunes votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed is aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly?
Aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice?
Aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert? Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood?
Yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson?
Yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes?
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker?
Aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Ms. Miller?
Aye.
Ms. Miller votes aye. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk, report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 yeas.
There being 25 nays and 18 ayes, the amendment fails. Is there any other member who wishes to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.